So even though I don't like speaking objectively about music a lot, the classic album conversation has always intrigued me a lot as a music listener. The entire idea of a group of people pretty much coming to an agreement that this said album is impactful, is important to the genre that they love, completely disregarding likeness towards the album, I think has always been a very interesting idea, something that I love about music discussion. But something that I have especially noticed when it comes to discussing modern classic albums is that people usually just delve into the usual reasoning of it has stood the test of time since the music is still being listened to and sounds good, and they'll mention 2 to 3 classic rap songs from said album, and they'll just pretty much say that that's the reason why it is a classic. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think there's plenty of albums that with just those descriptions can be deemed a classic rap album, but I always like finding the uniqueness of why said album is a classic album. The reason why Ready to Die is a classic and The Low End Theory is a classic is completely different, and finding that uniqueness has always interested me. So while I know that Good Kid MAAD City can be deemed a classic rap album off just the basis of it has stood the test of time, since it clearly has, it's been the longest charting rap album in history, surpassing the Eminem Show, and there's plenty of classic songs in there. You can pick MAAD City, Backseat Freestyle, The Art of Peer Pressure. There's plenty of classic songs to mention. But I want to look uniquely as to why Good Kid MAAD City is a classic rap album. To me, Good Kid MAAD City was Kendrick pretty much perfecting the concept album. It is something that he pretty much started with Section 80, which while it is a good album, I don't think quite reaches to the extent that Good Kid MAAD City does. And conceptual albums aren't anything new, but with each coming era, each section of rap is supposed to evolve in some type of way. Even though what Kendrick did here isn't something that's monumentally different in rap music, every era has its sets of conceptual rappers that dominate the era, and those concept albums can be considered classic. Before Kendrick, you can mention Lupe Fiasco dominating the conceptual rap lane, and he dropped what a lot of people would consider a classic album in Food and Liquor. And I think Kendrick has dominated that section of rap for his era. It being remembered as the most important concept album of this past decade, I think alone starts to give it that classic status. On top of that, Good Kid MAAD City has an incredible amount of impact and change in the rap landscape. Multiple albums, while not sounding exactly like Good Kid MAAD City, always seem to have the impression of wanting to accomplish exactly what the album did. Looking at an album like J. Cole's 2014 Forest Hills Drive, you can basically connect track by track a lot of the similarities that these two albums have. You can compare a track like A Tale of Two Cities to Money Trees, you can compare a track like '03 Adolescence to Black Boy Fly, and of course you can compare Wet Dreams to Shireen. It all just seems like J. Cole isn't doing this quite to the same level that Kendrick is. And these tracks all share similarities in what I believe is the most important factor for Good Kid MAAD City, and that is its subject matter. Moving on, you can also compare an album like My Crazy Life by YG to Good Kid MAAD City. It almost seems like YG is telling the same story as Kendrick, but from a different perspective, from the gangster's perspective, you may say. But some other albums seem to copy what Good Kid MAAD City did, but just more to the T. An album like Under Pressure by Logic gives me so many similarities to Good Kid MAAD City. You can also compare an album like Searching Sylvan by Quest, which is a little bit less known, but still shares a lot of the same stories and themes that Good Kid MAAD City set into place early last decade. One last album that you can probably throw into the mix is Vince Staples' Summertime '06. And I don't want to necessarily downplay any of these albums because I do think they're good. I'm just trying to exemplify how important Good Kid MAAD City is, because it really seemed to lay the blueprint to how a lot of the songwriting would play out when a lot of different artists would make their albums. And one last thing that I want to mention when it comes to the songwriting perspective that I think Kendrick had a big influence on was just how much he was playing around when it came to beat switches and changing tempos and flows when it came to the songwriting in Good Kid MAAD City. I personally think that My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy also had a huge imprint on how music was made throughout the 2010s, because Kanye experimented so much with bridges and hooks and verses and how he structured them. It's almost like he had like 2 or 3 bridges in each song and then had a hook, but also had another melody that could sort of come about as a second hook, and just had all these catchy imprints in his songwriting that a lot of people seem to mimic. It was very genius songwriting in My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. I think a little bit of that was also into Good Kid MAAD City, but just done in a different way. Just look at all of the beat switches here, like in MAAD City, The Art of Peer Pressure, Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst. And while beat switches aren't anything new, to the extent that Kendrick used beat switches and how often he used them throughout the entire album, I think is really something that was truly unique to this album. On top of that, not only changing beats, but also changing flows. A lot lot of rappers will change their flows only a few times in their career. Some rappers that are great, like Biggie, will never repeat a flow twice throughout an entire LP. And here comes Kendrick, who seems to be changing his flow not only throughout each song, but at times throughout each verse. And not only his flow, but his delivery, his enunciation as a rapper. At times rappers get downplayed so much when it comes to enunciation and delivery, because when it comes to music, I feel like a lot of that is catered towards singers and vocalists that have these booming vocal range. But I also think that some rappers have an extremely impressive vocal range, and Kendrick is the epitome of that. Listen to MAAD City, and his first verse is completely different from the second one. His second verse has a much different delivery, a much more higher pitch, simply because this was his perspective when he was in high school. When he was 16, his voice was higher, and he wants to show you that through his music. And I just feel like Kendrick was a huge factor in delivery throughout the 2010s. Not just changing up your flow and changing up your subject matter, but just changing up your enunciation, experimenting with that. That's something that I think Young Thug has also taken to a completely different dimension as well. What Kendrick did with this album would just give not only a conceptual route to a lot of rappers, but also the freedom to experiment with their voices and their enunciations to an extent that we haven't seen much in the past. So Good Kid MAAD City has the longevity, since it's still being listened to this day heavily. It has the impact, since a lot of rappers seems to take what he did with Good Kid MAAD City and lay it out as their blueprint for other albums. And it's clearly had a dramatic change in rap with how much he's influenced people when it comes to experimenting with their deliveries and their songwriting. I don't necessarily think that anything that was done in Good Kid MAAD City is groundbreaking or something that has never been done before. But just because something has never been done before, it doesn't mean that it can't be unique and different and have that status of being a classic. Like I said before, this is Kendrick in his own era showing what a perfect concept album is. Lupe has done it in the past. You can say Kanye has done it in the past, but this is Kendrick's era, and he's putting his own twist into it, and it's perfectly okay to say this is the classic concept album, or one of the classic concept albums for this era. Those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think on Kendrick's Good Kid MAAD City being deemed a classic. Let me know what you guys want to see from me next. I would love to hear your suggestions. Please like, please subscribe, please share, support me on Patreon if you have the chance, and I will see you all soon. Peace.